Hello, metal workers. Today I am going to do an experiment by not setting up my really bright light that I have, just to have less moving parts. And I'm trying to use the natural light for the most part and some lamps to illuminate this. So we'll see how the video turns out and if you're actually able to see what I'm doing. So in this video, I will use very fine grit sandpaper, 220, I believe it is, sanding block to remove places where there is paint that has flaked off due to rusting and remains due to it didn't rust in that particular place. But trying to leave the surface that I like, which was caused by the reaction of the Rust-Oleum underlayer of primer. So there's two layers of primer. There's Rust-Oleum oil-based paint underneath, which created these bubbles, and then Vallejo surface primer, as described in my Metal 004 video. That is an upper layer. So there's what the Rust-Oleum layer looks like on the back. I did that to protect it. And then that's what the surface primer layer looks like at the top. Now I want to leave these bubbles because I feel like it looks like gecko skin. And then what I'll also do is use these WarPaints Fanatic, the new paint by Army Painter, in a method called glazing. So there's my triad right there. What glazing is using very, very thin layers of acrylic paint to build up the color. And what I want to do is give the lizard more three-dimensionality by building up the color, lighter and lighter colors toward the top of the lizard where the light would normally shine, and leaving it dark down on the lower layers where if this were three-dimensional, the sun would less shine. Now this is a complete experiment. I've never done anything like this with a flat object like this. It's got, when they created it, they gave it some three-dimensionality. Now it should have continued through there, but that's been damaged by my Labrador dog, and there it's been damaged. But see, it's kind of bent in a way that makes it three-dimensional. But I'm going to bring out that to a higher degree by using a paint trick and tricking the eye to make it look like it's more three-dimensional. So I'm going to start by just sanding the places where there's transitions, where there's higher and lower paint like this, with this very fine sandpaper. I don't want to remove much of the primer, but it looks like I actually am. It looks like I'm actually seeing the oil-based primer down below it, which probably is okay as long as I don't get down to metal. I'm glad I used this fine a sandpaper, this fine of a sanding block, because heavier grit, lower number grit of sandpaper would take off more material. So I've described the grits of sandpaper in my other videos if you watch them, Metal through Metal 4. And I'll probably have to be happy with some of these surface irregularities because it looks like the sanding block has actually taken off too much material. I probably should have gone with a finer sandpaper, and what I could do is put another layer of primer over this after the sanding that I just did to try to level out the surface more, but I'm not going to do that because I want to get into the glazing. So I have just put some water on my wet palette. I am going to mix paint with 50% water. So I'll go ahead and go probably in the middle here would be green. So I put about 2 drops of water down, and then I'm going to shake this Army Painter paint for 50 times. 10, 23, 24, 25. And then I'm going to put 2 drops of this paint right in with the water. So it's already going to be really thin by the time I even put it on the wet palette. It's going to be very thin. I'm using really, really bad brushes. This brush was purchased in a set at Walgreens for about 5 cents, this brush. And I don't want to sacrifice one of my good brushes for this. Okay, I think I'm going to need more paint than that. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat that process again. Put about 50% water, 50% paint. So shout out to Dana Howell, a painter on YouTube. She said that these Army Painter WarPaints Fanatics perform really, really good when diluted highly. So I want to dilute this highly. So I'm going to put a little bit on my wet palette, spread it out, and look at how beautifully that thins without breaking down. By breaking down, I mean there's places where there isn't paint and there is paint. That's what I assume people mean by that. But in addition, I'm going to use WarPaint Stabilizer, which I don't really know what this is, but what I want something is that like an extender where I can thin it down even more. Yes. So that allows me to thin it down to really, really super thin and still retain its properties. Look at that. Look at how amazing that is. And that's what I'm going to begin to layer on the gecko. And I'm going to layer paint everywhere except for the very edge. The reason being that the very edge, I want to look darkest, like it's down lower from the light and the light is not shining there as much. Look at how beautifully that covers. If anything, it's still too thick. Challenging brush to try to do the small areas with. So when I looked at my metal stuff in the garden that was rusting, and I had normally painted with oil paints, I wanted to do something a little bit more fancy that I've learned from painting miniatures. dry. When I'm done with all the steps of glazing with these different colors, these are deep greens, Eternal Hunt, which is the third darkest color in the deep greens, and Ferocious Green, which is the lightest color in the deep greens. And then I switched to a different flexible triad, as Army Painter calls their 6 paints. I switched to a vibrant green right in the middle for my highest level. So I'm really bringing it up from green to yellow. Now I'm going to get a little bit more paint on my brush. I'm going to thin it out. I'm going to put some more stabilizer. Sorry for doing it off camera. Look at how nice that is. I'm going to put some more stabilizer, I think right in the middle of it. I'm not sure if this is the right product I should be using for this. I was hoping to find something that was called extender, because I want to extend the paint. I want it to have everything in it. And I probably could have used flow improver or thinner or any of those things. But this is, I think, doing what I want it to do, which is get really, really thin paint. I think that's working nicer because it seems to stick to itself better than it sticks to the primer too. So it's flowing off the brush more nicely on the second layer. I think I'll actually do 3 coats instead of 2. So I'll put the rest of my paint on a palette. I'll put more stabilizer. I know it's off camera, but I'm just doing the same thing as I did before. Diluting this paint really, really a lot. Make it very transparent. So glazing is using very transparent layers of paint to build up the color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the upper surfaces and kind of not do where the paint is pooling in there, which I'm okay with the paint pooling in places, but I'm not going to add more to that. I'm going to add paint to the flatter places where paint is not pooling. So I'm really kind of highlighting this thing, and probably highlighting is not what I want to do for iridescence. So this is kind of an experiment. So maybe it'll look really good when it's highlighted, and then I'll mess it all up by doing the iridescent paint. But I always wanted to do this experiment but I wanted to do it on something that I'll probably repaint next year when it rusts anyways, or when my dog tears it up. All right, now I'm going to use a slightly finer brush for the next step. This is distilled water. But again, a very cheap brush. So this brush is fairly pointed a little bit, but again, it's a 5-cent brush. So I'm not going to tear up one of my good brushes by painting on metal with it. So I'm going to take the ferocious green and I'm going to do the same thing. For 3, for 4, for 5, for 6, for 7, for 8, for 9, 50. Okay, so I'm going to put some water in the dry palette. I think you can see this on camera. And I think I'm going to start a little bit more dilute. I'm going to just use 1 drop of paint. This may be too thin. Let's see. Look at that. Doesn't even break down, as thin as it is. It's incredibly thin. Wow. I think I'm just going to try that just with water and no stabilizer. See how that works out. So I'm not going to go up to the very surface or the very edge. I'm going to try to leave a little bit of original green around the edges. And the thing is, if you whoops, like I just did, if you whoops, it doesn't really matter because it's such a thin layer that when you get done with 3 layers, a mistake on 1 layer won't really show up as much, right? And I think the middle of that painted area actually looks a little more bright. And I'm thinking that it may dry faster being more thin. Maybe not. Maybe more water and less paint, it'll dry slower. I don't know. Just doing some stippling to try to get the, just touching the brush to it to try to get some paint in the areas where it's dark, where I don't want it to be dark. I'm actually fairly pleased with that, and I hope y'all can see it. I think you can. You can't see the end of its tail really, but yeah, I think I'm going to sacrifice you not being able to see the end of its tail. But you just have to trust me that the end of its tail is turning out very nicely too. All right, again, I'm getting some more of my really, really dilute paint, which is so good. I could dilute it just, it's really 75% water or so, and 25% paint. Maybe even less paint. Ooh, what happened here? Guess that just became a pool. And I didn't know I was going to be stippling this, but this kind of looks like a good method to use. I was noticing the effects I got on miniatures, and I wanted that effect on my garden metalwork. The nice thing about using this cheap brush is I have no desire to be nice to it whatsoever. I can throw it away when I'm done if I want. But I doubt if it'll even mess it up. It's a little bit heavy in these areas, so I'm just going to remove some paint actually from these areas. Don't want to remove that much. And I think I might stick to the same brush and just stipple the last color. Kind of follow that little crease that the metal worker put into it. A little heavier than I want right there. I'm getting a lot of extended working time, which is nice actually. Sorry for working off camera. I don't think you can see that part of the tail. I'm just kind of drawing a line down the center of the lizard with the paint that I picked up from the pooling areas on my brush. If you would please subscribe, it really helps the channel, and if you like what I'm doing, please drop a comment too. Tell me about the projects that you're doing with painting. If you put videos on YouTube, I probably already watched them. But if you don't put videos on YouTube, tell me what you're doing. I read all my comments and I comment back. All right, I think I'm gonna mix up my next paint. I think I'm gonna make this a little bit heavier so that its flow is controlled. So I'm gonna put 2 drops of paint and I'm gonna put less water. Boy, that's a nice color green. Let's see what it looks like on the wet palette. It's pretty thin. Or it's pretty light anyways. Probably I'm not an expert enough to tell the difference between thinness and lightness yet. But I'm working on it. All right, now I'm going to try to find places where it looks to be dry. I'm going to try to stipple a highlight on there. I'm doing the edges of his eyes like, you know how lizards have that little raised part by their eye? And they usually have some grooves. On the front of their mouth too, so kind of do that. Too much paint on my brush. But I can always take a dry brush and remove anything I don't like. Right? Now the reason I'm thinking that this might not be a good subject for iridescent is because theoretically the dark green will iridesce more than the lighter green. Having more white will be more of a pearlescent. So I'm purposely doing something that I think might not work, so you might only want to follow what I've done up to this video and not what I do in the next video. But I've kind of always wanted to do this experiment. I'm really interested in the technique of highlighting, but I think it might work against my technique of iridescent. Just kind of making a little eyebrow because of the shape of the brush. I'm not going to say I dislike it. And of course, because it really is pretty thin in a glaze. It's starting to blend in with the rest of the paint. Which I'm okay with. Now see, there's a little bit too much paint here. I didn't want these two places, areas of paint to connect. There. Now just kind of fix this a little bit. You get a long working time. So I think this is really nice. I'm using my diluted paint right out of the dry palette. I'm not actually using the wet palette right now. Because I feel like the paint is dilute enough. Kind of going between the stipples. Forgot to move it back so you probably couldn't see what I was doing at the front of the lizard, the gecko. And I think I'm going to put a stippling pattern. Now here's some paint I don't want there. I'm going to put some stippling, I believe. I think I'm actually going to, so that it's less fluid, I think I'm actually going to add one more drop of paint to my dry palette and mix it in. And I think I'm actually going to add a little stippling to around these guys. Yeah, that's better controlled. And if I wasn't making a video, I would probably let it dry between steps more, and I'd be better off. I'd get better results. But I also don't want to make the video super, super long. And what a lot of YouTubers do, but I'm not that technical, is they speed up they take a long video and speed it up. Just doing some stippling on the limbs. But technically the feet should be down lower, so I'm avoiding those areas. I think I'm going to remove some of this. So it's blended into the head, and I certainly don't want this pooling here. So I'll remove that with the dry brush. Pretty good work with my left hand, right? The surface is more irregular than a miniature, so in a way it's harder. So at this point, I'm working as much with this dry brush, and I think I'll get a drier brush. I'm working more with this dry brush than I am with the wet brush. Just removing places where I don't want the paint. Or if in this case I put the paint somewhere where I don't want it. Or I decided I don't want it. Okay, to make the video not so long, I'm going to end it now. So I'm just going to let it dry, and then I'm going to paint it iridescent in my next video. And I'm not going to say that I'm not going to go in and change it a little bit after this video because of time constraints, and sometimes you end up doing stuff like that. But I just don't know how long anyone's going to be able to watch me do this. So hopefully you find this very satisfying, and I could do it for hours and you'd watch it. But just in case that's not true, I'm going to stop the video. Thank you, metal workers.